Hi there, I'm Julia Strand, and I'm happy to have the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm very sorry I can't give this talk live, but I will be joining the conference later for the panel discussion, and so I look forward to answering your questions then. The conference organizers asked me to give an overview of how I incorporate teaching about open science into my classes and in my research lab. And so today I'm going to give an overview of that process. And I'm also going to share a few of my favorite assignments for teaching about principles of open science. I've chosen assignments that are rather modular in order to make it easier for other people, to steal these assignments and incorporate them into your own classes. I'll also include links to all of my materials as I'm going, as well as a summary slide at the end that has links to everything that I've referenced today. So my guess is that if you are here and watching this session, you don't need much convincing that teaching open science is worthwhile. But I want to highlight just a couple of reasons that I find the most compelling for why it makes sense to teach students, and especially undergraduates, about open science practices. The first is that I believe open science practices strengthen the quality of my research. And so I want to make sure that students are well prepared to employ those practices in the research that they do after my lab. But I think that learning about open science is useful even for people who don't go on to do research themselves, because it trains students to be critical consumers of research. Carleton College, where I teach, is an undergraduate-only institution. And so many of the students that I work with won't go on to pursue careers in psychology because many of them aren't even majoring in psychology. So my goal isn't exclusively to train people how to do science. It is training future non-scientists how to evaluate the science that they encounter in their everyday lives. So training students in open science practices helps to convey that science is a process and not just an end product. I teach undergraduate courses at the introductory and mid-level and a senior seminar as well. And my approach has been to gradually work in open science content bit by bit into each of these courses. Really, every time I teach a class, I just find a way to squeeze in a little bit more methodology and a little bit more open science. In the introductory course that I teach, I assign a reading and devote a class period to teaching about key concepts in the replication crisis and the credibility revolution. I do this near the start of term so that I can be referring back to the content that we established in that class throughout the rest of the class. One of the exercises that I regularly use asks students to compare an original study and a failed replication. And I do this as a way of trying to make very concrete some of the concepts that we talked about related to replication and measurement and the incentive structure of science. The example that I use is the Barge et al. 1996 paper that showed that participants who were primed to think about the elderly walked more slowly than unprimed participants. As I'm sure many of you know, this study caused quite a splash and demonstrated effects that people found very compelling with regards to behavioral priming. A subsequent study failed to replicate that effect when the experimenters were blind to condition. So in my intro psych class, I present detailed information about the methods of both the original study and the failed replication. And I ask students to brainstorm to try to identify all of the reasons that the two studies may have arrived at different conclusions. They come up with really long lists of differences between the two studies that might have been influential. And this exercise requires them to think very carefully about methodology and bias, culture, language, and even the probabilistic nature of replication. So did the original study fail to replicate because of a methodological difference, just by chance, because it was a false positive? And how do we know? Students readily offer up suggestions for differences that may have been influential between the two studies. And then I model thinking through how we would evaluate whether those differences are likely to have led to the different outcomes. I then present some of the fallout of the failed replication attempt to give them the opportunity to think about the incentive structure of science and what motivates researchers. And this really helps students to see the human side of doing research, right? The fact that our jobs and our reputations and maybe even our self-esteem can be tangled up in our findings, and that those factors have the potential to influence our behavior. So this is a great exercise to do, especially at the start of term, because it can be done with no background on the topic or in psychology whatsoever. And because it really requires that they think very deeply about generalizability and how methodology affects outcomes. It's also a nice opportunity to dispel the misconception that a single failed replication attempt nullifies all previous results, and to reinforce that conclusions about a body of findings require thoughtfully evaluating a lot of literature. The full versions of the slides that I use for this and the in-class problem sets are available on the OSF link on your screen. Near the end of term, I cover cross-cultural psychology and the problems associated with using homogeneous and Western and educated samples in psychological research. And having already discussed direct versus conceptual replications in this example is really useful because that gives the students tools to understand issues related to external validity in research as well. In addition to talking about open science in my introductory course, I also devote a unit to it in my mid-level class as well. That class is Sensation and Perception, and students take a large lecture as well as a hands-on methods-focused lab course that has typically 12 to 14 students. And in the lab course, students read about issues related to open science, and we again have a discussion to familiarize them with the topic. Then we do a few different activities to help solidify those concepts and show them how they apply to research on sensation and perception. And I'll talk about two of those activities today. The first is, after learning about the replication crisis and open science practices, I ask students to revisit an empirical article that we read near the beginning of term. They catalog every decision that the researchers made. So things like how they operationalized the dependent variable, which observations they excluded as outliers, et cetera. Then students speculate about when in the research process the researchers are likely to have made those decisions. Did they decide this before they ran the study, after they saw the data? Is it impossible to know? And why might the timing of when they made those decisions affect the outcomes? So did they decide what would count as an outlier before they saw the shape of the data? And why does it matter if they did? This turns out to be a great exercise for demonstrating how knowledge about open science affects how students evaluate research. So remember that this is an article that they have already read. They read this article at the start of term, and at that point, they're mostly reading it to find out what the answer is, right? What were the results that the research team found? And so they kind of gloss over things like which outliers were removed and why. But then, after we talked about open science, they become much more thoughtful about how researchers made those decisions and when researchers made those decisions and how it can affect study outcomes. We then also talk about how pre-registration would have affected this process and made some of the questions that they raised about the studies, made the answers to those questions more transparent. I love this activity because it is amazing to see how learning about open science changes how students evaluate something that they've already read once. One of my students even accused me of giving them an edited version of the article the second time around because, quote, I definitely would have remembered it if they'd said it the first time, right? So it's a really nice way of seeing how learning about this content changes what students notice and how they evaluate primary literature. In another activity in the same sensation and perception lab, I give students a large data set on self-reported individual differences in perceptual experiences. So it includes questions like, how much do you like spicy food? Do you tend to get motion sick? And how do you see famous illusions like the dress? So I tell my students about this data set, and I first ask them to use what we have talked about in class to make specific directional hypotheses about pairs of variables. And I require them to pre-register those predictions with me prior to actually getting to analyze the data. And so they predict things like people who hear Laurel in the infamous auditory illusion tend to be older than people who hear Yanny. After they have finished making those predictions and reporting their pre-registered analyses, then I give them the opportunity to explore the data and I tell them, dig around until you find something cool. Their eyes get really big when I tell them that. Basically, I'm asking them to p-hack, Stick with me. After each group has found something cool, we discuss their findings as a group, and I ask them how they would report those findings in a manuscript. What's the story that you would tell about why these two pairs of variables happen to correlate? So there are a couple of great things that students get out of this exercise. First, they gain an appreciation for how easy it is to explain noise they see in the data. That is, to hypothesize after results are known, or to HARK. So for example, they can all of a sudden readily explain why it really does make sense that morning people are more adventurous eaters than night owls, or why the amount of musical training that someone has correlates with how much they like fried food. And I think that this is a useful exercise for students to engage in, because it can be very easy for us as faculty to characterize p-hacking and harking as practices that are done maliciously, when in fact, I think they very often happen unintentionally. And so it's a great reminder to students that it's necessary to implement safeguards against those practices, because otherwise questionable research practices can very easily emerge and intuitively make sense, right? I really like giving students the opportunity to see how easy it is for us to convince ourselves that we really should have expected something all along, even if it isn't something that we necessarily would have pre-registered. So this exercise is great because it really drives home differences between confirmatory pre-registered work and purely exploratory or non-theory driven work. So students come away with really strong intuitions about which of the things they found in the data is the most likely to replicate. It's easy to explain to students the difference between confirmatory and exploratory work, but I found that actually getting to work with data helps to reinforce those concepts much more strongly than just hearing about them would. I also teach an entire course on open science that senior undergraduates take to prepare to write their senior honors theses. So after we spend several weeks learning about open science content, they then write their theses about a content topic of their choosing, viewed through the lens of open and reproducible research practices. So for example, they may trace whether and how effects have replicated through the literature. They may analyze the psychometric properties of a variety of different measurement tools that are all used to operationalize a given construct, or they might do a systematic review to try to understand the causes for inconsistency in the literature. Teaching an entire course on open science practices is wonderful because we get to explore the content in a lot of depth, and because students then assess a research topic of their choosing based on what they've learned. So all of the materials for that course are available at the link shown, and of course I'm happy to have people reuse them. So if you are thinking about incorporating open science practices into your teaching, the first recommendation that I would make is to add content incrementally. It isn't necessary to massively overhaul your syllabus to incorporate some open science. You can add one lecture or reading at a time. And so if adding a lot seems overwhelming, just remember that every little bit helps. I've also gotten in the habit of structuring my course schedule to incorporate open science content early in the term. That way, even if I'm only devoting a single class period to it, I can spend the whole rest of the term kind of referencing back to concepts that we talked about in that class. And I would also encourage you to make use of the wealth of great materials that are already available. The course syllabi for open and reproducible research methods on OSF has dozens of syllabi for courses like this, and many of them include readings and slides and activities. And Fort, who you'll be hearing from later on in the session, also has a wealth of resources that you can take advantage of. The community of people who teach about open science is, in my experience, very friendly and very eager to help one another. So don't feel like you need to reinvent the wheel. We've all shared our materials openly for a reason, and it's to make it easier for other people to adopt them. In addition to teaching open science in my content courses, it's also part of the training students get when they work in my lab. And I really think about the teaching that I do in the lab as being very similar to teaching that I do in the classroom. It's just the content is different, the number of students are different, but the goal is still to help students develop this appreciation for science as a process. So my research lab consists of 8 to 10 undergraduates who work closely with me on projects related to how people understand spoken language, like you're doing right now. If you want more information on that work, as well as more information about how specifically I train students in open science practices in my lab, the link on the screen will take you to another video that's all about that. One of the real joys with working with undergrads is that this is their first experience doing novel empirical research. So I don't need to correct any bad habits they've learned elsewhere, right? I don't have to train them out of p-hacking because they've never even had the opportunity to try it. And given that I don't have graduate students, the undergrads are responsible for the entire research process. And so I weave open science practices throughout everything that I'm teaching them. This schematic is from a 2021 paper in Collabora that shows many of the practices that I use in my lab. And there's been a lot written about the benefits of these practices generally. So I'm not going to talk about, for instance, like why pre-registration is good for science. Instead, I'm going to focus on how I teach about these practices to my students and the benefits that I see to training students in these practices. So I'm going to talk through the order in which I began incorporating these practices into my lab, and so teaching students about them as well. So the easiest entry point, of course, and where we started was by reading and thinking and talking about these issues. And so for us, that involved devoting a lab meeting periodically to reading an article about open science practices and then discussing whether adopting those practices would be a good fit for our work, or reading about different methods that researchers have used to avoid bias, and then thinking through where in our work is bias most likely to creep up. If you are looking for a good starting place, that Collabora paper is a really nice introductory reading for a lab group. The next thing we did was started sharing our materials. So my research is on spoken language, and so a lot of our studies require lots of sound files and video files of people talking. And so it's very easy to make an open science framework page and just upload all of those files after the study's been published. And in my experience, students really readily understand the importance and benefits of sharing our stuff. It's also a nice opportunity to teach about increasing accessibility and access to scientific resources. So if, for instance, other labs don't have the resources to record stimuli in a soundproof booth with high quality audio recording equipment, we can help them and we can facilitate them doing their science by providing our stimuli. We next started sharing data and code. And this is a great teaching tool because it requires that the code that we write is very carefully commented and the data that we collect are very carefully organized. And so having that clear commented code from previous projects also turns out to be really useful for students who are just learning data cleaning and wrangling. So when a student sits down to analyze their first set of data, I don't have to just throw a bunch of files at them and say, good luck. I can say, well, why don't you go onto our OSF page and look at a similar project that we've done previously and look at the steps that were involved in analyzing that data. And it gives them a useful starting place. And instilling good habits by writing clean commented code also helps undergrads build a strong foundation for graduate school if they end up pursuing that, because learning statistics and R can be really daunting if they haven't had the opportunity to work closely with them before. The next thing we started doing was posting preprints to make all of our work publicly accessible. And the benefit that I have seen to this in terms of undergraduates is that we can get really rapid feedback on our work. So post a preprint, share it on Twitter, and the students are really delighted to see, to get that feedback and to get it very quickly, because otherwise they'd have to wait around several months for peer review and then even longer to see if we get feedback on it after it's been published. But sharing it rapidly and publicly enables a lot more conversation about the work. And so it helps students feel like they're part of a research community rather than just sending work out into the void and never hearing how it's received. The next open science practice that we adopted was pre-registering our work. And students have been very receptive to pre-registration. I think in part because it lines up really well with the naive view of science that most people have. You plan what you're going to do, and then you do it, and then you report what you did fully. Pre-registration is also really useful when working with undergraduates because it may be that months pass between planning the study and analyzing the data. And in that time, new students may have joined the lab. And so it's really helpful to have a document that explicitly details what we had planned to do. So in addition to all of the other benefits of pre-registration, it's a really helpful teaching tool because it helps quickly onboard new students and get them familiar with the projects that we're working on. The most recent kind of traditional open science practice that we've implemented is registered reports. My lab has now published 2 registered reports, and we've had great experiences with them. Knowing that students have a guaranteed publication regardless of study outcomes is very useful. And even if the data aren't fully collected by the time that they graduate, it's great for them to have an in-principle acceptance when they leave the lab, and then we can continue to collaborate after they've graduated. Finally, I've also begun doing more deliberate training about detecting and preventing research errors. So I'm talking about things like accidentally swapping your column labels or analyzing raw data rather than cleaned data and things like that. Most researchers don't get explicit training about best practices to avoid these errors other than be careful and don't mess up. So I've written a paper called Error Tight to help my lab and yours come up with principled ways of reducing the frequency of mistakes we make and also increasing the likelihood that we'll catch any errors that we do make. So this is really complementary to many other open science practices because it's another way of helping to ensure that the work that we do is as robust and as replicable as possible. So these are some of the concrete ways that I've tried to teach this content to undergraduates. And I don't have data about how what I have done affects student learning, although some folks do have data about it. But my impressions about how students have responded to learning about open science is really positive. It also delightfully makes them pay a lot more attention to methodology than the way that I used to teach psychology. My goal is to present science not as a collection of facts, but as a process, an often imperfect and deeply human process. And teaching about open science helps to convey that very clearly. I was somewhat nervous about teaching about the replication crisis because I didn't want students to lose faith in science, right? But I found that it really doesn't make them give up on science. It gives them an appreciation for the complexities of science and a more nuanced sense of what conclusions we can draw from individual studies and from whole bodies of literature. Here are all of the links to the teaching materials that I mentioned together in one place. And these are 2 other papers that you might find useful when looking to incorporate open science practice into your own teaching. Thank you very much for your attention. My contact information is shown below. I would be happy to hear from you. And the slides for this talk are on my Open Science Framework page. I look forward to the panel discussion and to answering your questions. Thanks.